So I wanted to welcome everyone that's here. I'm excited about the committee, the staff support. I mean, I'm excited what the year will bring here. So I also laid out committee rules and conferee rules over on the table so that you guys, if you want to pick that up, you can have them for your files. And there is a few of the slide presentations over there. If you want any more, don't hesitate to get with my office and we'll make some for you. So to start with, I would like to, is there any bill introductions that would like to be made at this time? Okay, thank you. So with that being said, we will go right into the presentation. Today we have with us from the Idaho National Laboratory, Christine King, which is the director of GAIN. And GAIN stands for Gateway for Accelerated Innovation in Nuclear. And then Tay Stevenson is the CEO from Envoy Public Labs. So they're going to be here and have the hour, and we'll have a little time for a few questions. So Christine, welcome to the committee and also welcome to Kansas. And you've been here before, so welcome back.
Yeah, so, no, thank you. It's good to see you again. I met Senator Fagg on a tour of Idaho National Labs with the Energy Resource Council. And so thank you for having me here today. I will tell you, so Kansas, the reason I've been to Kansas before is because I've actually done some work at the Wolf Creek Nuclear Station. Prior to joining the laboratory, I worked for 27 years with the existing commercial fleet across the United States. So I've seen many of our existing reactors in action or inaction during outages. One of my favorite material scientists and engineer comes from Wolf Creek. He took me under his wing a couple decades ago, Mo Dingler, and helped as we looked at maintenance policies for nuclear power plants, thinking about how we take accelerated corrosion testing and apply it to an operating plant. So with that, I also want to preface this with, I'm not here advocating for more nuclear power or nuclear energy in Kansas. Clearly, that's your decision. But, you know, I'm here to help talk about the new technologies that are available. I'm going to kind of skip a rock across the surface, so it may not feel very satisfying at all. But what I'm hoping is that this is not our first interaction. And if we could go to the first slide, I'll talk a little bit about what GAIN is. So GAIN is a unique initiative of the Department of Energy, the Office of Nuclear Energy. And we are here to help private companies make the resources and the research that the national labs and the Department of Energy used and useful in the pursuit of new nuclear technologies. So we have a nexus to commercialization, and I specifically specialize in the public-private partnership between the Department of Energy, national labs, and private entities. One of the ways we do that in the upper left-hand corner is our voucher program. The easiest way to describe that is you write a scope of a private company can write a scope of work for national lab scientists to execute on your behalf. We've been very successful with this program. It's been in place since 2016. We've issued 95 vouchers and worked with over 57 unique companies. We might be the fastest decision makers in the government. From the time that our application process closes and we issue decisions is 6 weeks. The results of the work that we do for you are protected to the customer itself, so for 5 years. So you can see it kind of has a lot of things that are appreciative of the commercial fact of and wanting to get this technology to market. In the same vein, we help to share the historical information. Before we decided in the United States to have our operating fleet be a light water reactor fleet, we actually built and designed and tested many of the types of reactors that are being considered today. And we built a lot of those demonstrations at Idaho National Labs. So our historical information, our design information, and our operating information is what we call, is in that rediscovering the past to power the future. We dig up those old drawings, we digitize them, we reclassify them, and we make them available to companies that are pursuing new nuclear technology. So this is kind of one of the ways that we're trying to make sure that the money that we've invested previously in nuclear energy and that research is used and useful. This year, one of the projects that we're doing is on the lower left-hand side. As you might imagine, one of the questions is, so how much does it cost? And so what we're trying to do is look at the different classes of new advanced reactors and put together a cost estimate with an uncertainty band that you can use in integrated resource planning. The first place we're going to be putting this cost information is in the National Renewable Energy Lab's ATB database. And that database is where utilities go to compare different generation sources. Mr. Chair, I'm a little hot up here and would love to take my jacket off, but I don't want to be offensive or disrespectful. Thank you, sir. I layered, that was a poor choice and I won't do that. That was my first decision. Okay. No, I do not want to melt down either. Good joke, all right. We're gonna end on that note. On the right-hand side, today is, so as these technologies get closer to commercialization, we're not only talking with developers, but also looking at where these technologies may be built. And it's important that we make sure that everyone has, nuclear can be an intimidating technology. So helping to make sure that everybody has the information they need to participate in the conversation. When you choose nuclear energy or nuclear power, these are 100-year decisions. This is a technology that you will have for many generations. So we want to make sure that everyone is fully informed when making those kinds of decisions. The other two parts here is some of my personal research that I do, looking at the transition of coal stations to nuclear power stations. And if we have some time today, I'll share some of that. But let's go to the next slide. Okay, so future energy systems. This is really the crux of the matter. There's nothing in energy today that's not changing or isn't under innovation. And at the end of the day, we're going to need these systems to be integrated and working together in a way that they have not done so far. So we have lots of different generation sources, but we primarily work independent of each other for the most part. So, and you notice that I'm not talking about power. I'm talking about energy, because that's really what we're transitioning. We have electricity, but if we're using electricity to decarbonize different sectors, it's going to increase the demand on electricity. There are some sectors that you won't be able to decarbonize with electricity. So that's where you need the high temperature process heat that normally has been provided by coal, natural gas. I apologize. So let's go. And so all of this works in concert to provide what we will have from energy systems in the future, which are synthetic fuels, process heat for industry, and electricity. If we can go to the next slide. All right, so what does that mean for advanced nuclear? So Wolf Creek is a large light water reactor, 1,000 megawatts, and primarily produces electricity. Wolf Creek could be used, like other existing nuclear power plants, to produce hydrogen. There are some demonstrations going on in the United States where they're looking at using the process heat or the heat thermal energy from existing reactors to produce hydrogen. The biggest change is the size. In the past, we have only deployed 1,000 megawatt units. Now we're looking at anywhere from 500 to 300 megawatt units, all the way down to micro reactors. And again, looking at different outputs, electricity, the generation of hydrogen, and process heat. If we could go to the next slide. So what is really different? Advanced reactors, you will hear the term walk-away safety. What does that mean? So today's systems require active intervention in certain accident conditions. Okay, so there's a defense in depth, but there are active safety systems. In the new designs, we're using passive safety systems or inherent safety systems. What that means, passive safety systems is kind of like the airbag in your car. So it's installed if there is an impact and an electrical signal goes to that airbag, the airbag deploys. So that's an engineering decision that was made in the design process. So in some of our advanced reactors, we're looking at things like using natural circulation for cool down. So if you lose off-site power, you still have, through natural circulation, the ability for that reactor to cool itself. So that's an example of a passive safety system. Inherent safety is taking advantage of the physics of different situations. So for fast reactors, they actually, as they increase in temperature, if the reaction actually starts to self-modulate and it shuts itself down. So that's an example of inherent safety. So in the different types of reactor designs that are out there, those are the types of features that you'll talk about or you'll see. I talked about the versatility. I want to hit on waste a little bit here, but I also have a couple other slides on waste. The big thing here is the ability to recycle and reuse waste from our existing plants to power the new plants. Today's reactors operate with what's called low enriched uranium at about 5% uranium. The new reactors will operate with, many of them will operate with HALEU, high assay, low enriched uranium, and it's enriched to a 20% value. So we can take, in our existing fleet, a fuel assembly will spend about 6 years in the core. But when it's declared spent fuel or waste, it still has about 90% of usable fissile material. In this country, we have a once-through fuel cycle. So at the end of that, it is considered waste. We could make a decision to close the fuel cycle, recover that fissile material, and put it into a new product form for a new reactor. Let's go to the next slide. So what's happening now? This is the decade of prove it. So a big change has happened at the Department of Energy. I think my Deputy Assistant Secretary, Alice Capinetti, says it well. It's the decade of pencils down, build it and prove it. So what you see on this chart is a number of different demonstration projects that are underway. You'll see in the beginning, a lot of them are microreactors. Many of them are being deployed and done at Idaho National Labs. The Hermes test reactor is adjacent to Oak Ridge National Laboratory. On the tail end, on the right-hand side, you see 3 projects there. These are commercial scale demonstration projects. The X-Energy Dow project is in Texas. It is actually not the biggest project that Dow Chemical has going on, which is somewhat refreshing to hear when you talk about a nuclear project. And this is meant to support their chemical manufacturing plant at Seadrift. It's 4 100 megawatt modules. That's the X Energy, and it's a high temperature gas reactor. So the high temperature gas reactors are able to operate in a higher range and match industrial production much more closely than existing reactors. The Natrium reactor is being built in Wyoming, in Kemmer. It is a partnership of TerraPower, General Electric, and Rocky Mountain Power, or Pacificor. And this is a sodium fast reactor, 350 megawatts base load, but it's partnered with a molten salt thermal energy storage unit, big molten salt battery. And with that battery, they are able to peak for 5.5 hours up to 550 megawatts. The reason that was attractive to Pacificor is that allows them to accept as much renewables as they can when it's available, but also have the reliability that they're looking for and the backup that they need should the renewables not be online. The SMR 160 with Holtec, that's being considered in Michigan, actually at the same site as a recently retired light water reactor, Palisades. So in this decade, we're going to start to be able to touch and feel a lot of these new technologies and understand how they operate, and hopefully, you know, what this leads to is scale and deployment of these technologies, not only in the United States, but globally. And let's go to the next slide. On-site storage of used fuel or waste. So a lot of times, so I want to start with what is nuclear waste. It is not the 55-gallon drum with fluorescent green goo. I don't know how many of you watch The Simpsons, but unfortunately, that's what most people relate nuclear power to. It's not the mascot we were looking for. But inside these long tubes you see on the left-hand side is a ceramic pellet about the size of a gummy bear. That's one fuel pellet. Those tubes are tens of feet long, and they're organized in an array about the size of a piece of Wonder Bread, okay? And those fuel assemblies have spent 6 years in the core. They've spent about 5 years in a spent fuel pool to cool down thermally, not radioactively, but thermally. And then they're loaded into a stainless steel canister. It's a dual-purpose canister, so it's designed for storage and shipment. So we are ready to ship these canisters when the Department of Energy is ready for to receive and I'll talk about that next. So today, and then that canister, we vacuum out all the water, we pull out all the air, and we replace it with inert gas so it doesn't rust inside the canister. And then we load it into concrete storage casks. So those can be either vertical or horizontal. The person there gives you an idea of how big they are. And they're on concrete pads on the same site as our existing operating stations. So for advanced reactors, we should expect to have on-site storage of nuclear waste for the time being, until such time as the Department of Energy has consolidated our fuel storage. If we can go to the next slide. So I talked about the size. So let's just talk a little bit, like all the commercial waste that's been produced by the reactors in the United States since the 50s would fit on a football field, an American football field, not a soccer pitch, but an American football field to the height of 10 yards. Now, let's be clear, that's taking all the pellets out of the metal rods, and we don't do that. But if you were just looking at the fissile material itself. So the volume of waste is not much. And there's a lot of potential in there for us to repurpose and close our fuel cycle. And and turn that into other things. What's going on today relative to consolidating our waste into a fewer set of locations? The DOE is currently working on consent-based siting. And basically that is having conversations similar to this, but focused on nuclear waste, ensuring that a community that wants to host a consolidated fuel storage facility understands what they're getting into. So right now, there's consortia that are working in the states doing these types of community meetings. And then the next phase will be asking communities or states if they're interested in hosting these kinds of facilities. So that's the rapid tour of technology. Let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about what's going on across the United States with advanced energy or advanced nuclear energy. So in the past 2 years, 34 bills have passed in 23 states related to advanced nuclear energy. Most of those bills you can see are studies or task forces, and I'll talk a little bit in the next few slides about exactly what's going on with them. This is the most action we've seen at a state level on anything nuclear energy related in decades. You can see some of these are also around the regulatory and the permitting process. Wyoming and Alaska in particular have taken specific steps to simplify their energy permitting. It's not just about nuclear energy, but about energy permitting. And that has been kind of an all of the above strategy that those states are considering. Since we made this slide, we now have only 10 states that have moratoria remaining on the construction of nuclear power. Illinois recently overturned. How did that go? There was the Senate passed it, the governor vetoed it, and then the senator overwrote. No.
They reintroduced it, the new legislation partially repeals and then creates a regulatory pathway so that it fully is repealed.
See, that's why it's complicated. Anyway, Illinois has been fun to follow for the last 6 months. It's like, oh, it's done. It's not done. Okay. All right, next slide. Okay, so talking about the advanced nuclear feasibility study. So some of these are focused on technology and some of these are focused on policy. The Connecticut one I bring up, this was really a study looking at the production of hydrogen, but in talking about the production of hydrogen, they did talk about the nexus to nuclear energy. New Hampshire and Kentucky have just published their studies in the latter part of 2023. I have 2 slides to follow on that. But in the next few months, we expect Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Nebraska to all publish their studies. I point this out such that as if you're considering what you might do in Kansas, I would suggest that you start with looking at what other states have done and maybe seeing if that information can be exported and used here and applied here instead of retreading. Some of these studies are not specific to the states they were written in. One of the things that we're doing at GAIN is writing, if you don't enjoy reading 200-page reports, we're reading them and we're writing some 1-page summaries, and we're always happy to connect you with the authors and have a conversation instead of reading a 200-page report. But if you like 200-page reports, there's plenty to choose from. So if we go to the next slide. So Kentucky assembled a nuclear development working group, and it had experts from industry and national labs, the utilities in the state, some of the senators from the state, and representatives from the energy office. That was the committee that worked on this report that was delivered to the governor. The governor's question was simple. Are there any barriers to deploying nuclear energy in the state of Kentucky? And the answer was there's no insurmountable barriers, but there is work to be done. And as we did our work in this working group, there's a lot of different ways that you can consider using nuclear energy in your state. You can host an advanced reactor. You can manufacture and develop fuel, or you can participate in the supply chain, in the advanced manufacturing end of the supply chain as well. And each one of those has a different starting point. And so that was one of the things that I think was really good about this report too, was to help to understand those interdependencies as you look at those different options for nuclear energy. Kentucky is a energy exporting manufacturing state. And so you see here an interest in continuing to be an energy exporter and to support the industrial customers they have today and the ones that they want to attract in the future. They have a unique site, the Paducah Gaseous Diffusion Site, that was part of the Manhattan Project. And so wanting to see if that site could be reused or repurposed in part of the new fuel cycle for advanced reactors was part of the report's recommendations. So we're expecting to see Kentucky and some Senator Carroll in particular to introduce some new legislation to establish this authority in Kentucky, which takes its lead from the Idaho Line Commission. If we could go to the next slide. So New Hampshire's report highlighted many of the same things that that Kentucky did. A couple of different challenges. One, they recognize it as an essential element in achieving their net zero goals in the economy. However, cost and reliability are the things that are driving cost efficiency, and the reliability of new nuclear are one of the primary attributes that has drawn interest from the state. The primary challenge is they're in a deregulated energy market. So a recognition that it would be difficult for them to be a first-of-a-kind adopter on advanced nuclear technology. So they're probably in a phase of looking at what those policy options might be, and maybe how they look at participation in supply chain capabilities. And if we could go to the next slide. So that was feasibility studies, but there's also working groups. North Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. 3 of them you see have been mandated by the governor. These are ongoing working groups and committees. So nuclear energy, so they're allowing the interest of the committees and the questions that they have to shape their work. We expect that they will issue some reports along the way. Recently, South Dakota and Nebraska finished their working groups. And in South Dakota, it did not lead to the establishment of a coalition or a working group. And in Nebraska, they're considering legislation to mandate the replacement of decommissioned coal or natural gas with other baseload technologies. This is similar to a bill that was recently passed in Wyoming as well. And finally, there's a number of, if we could go to the next slide, there's a number of national level working groups. 2 I've listed here. One is still under development with the Governors Association, but NARUC and NASIO have teamed up and they have an advanced nuclear state collaborative. This was established in the fall of last year. And both of these groups, not only the NARUC, NASIO, but the NCSL, Nuclear Legislative Working Group, are built for that peer-to-peer sharing on policy and the utilities commissions and the energy offices. The map is showing you the states that are darkest participate in both of those committees. The 2s participate in the NARUC-NASIO, and the 1s participate in the Nuclear Legislative Working Group with the National Coalition of State Legislators. So there's a lot of activity to plug into. There is definitely, so one of the things I'd like to leave you with from a gain perspective is bring your questions, bring your requests. Don't assume that it's not part of my remit or my mission or things like that. Let me figure that out. But I'm more than happy to help you get connected to the information you need, whether it's in the labs or in the private sector. With that, the next part of the presentation is focused on coal to nuclear transition. And so if you'll help me here, Colin, I'd like to skip ahead 2 slides. So there are a number of states here that have been publicly talking about how they might transition coal stations to nuclear stations. And there's a variety of different reasons to do that. The biggest, I would say there's 2 large drivers to these types of projects. One is the preservation of the infrastructure of the plant. I'm not talking about reuse of everything of the plant, but definitely reuse of the transmission connections, your substation, your water, your roads, your rail, those types of things. What that leads to is preservation of jobs for the workforce that is at the current station. And so we've been doing some work to understand how feasible this is. There's a lot of research out there that wasn't there 18 months ago. If we could go forward 1 slide. One of the studies that the Department of Energy funded was trying to understand, let me back up a half a step. The reason this is even feasible to think about is because we're building smaller advanced reactors. If we didn't have a smaller footprint and a similar megawatt output, we could not even imagine using the same transmission connections, right? But because we're changing the nuclear product, it's not exactly plug and play, but we can think of it in that manner. The map on the right-hand side here is the result of evaluating the operating coal stations in the United States today, doing initial screening to see if they could site an advanced reactor. So many of the things that you use to site a coal station are the same things, the same characteristics you look for in siting. We need access to water, you need a fair amount of land. So those types of things are similar for coal and nuclear. Where nuclear has flooding characteristics, we have to consider seismic limitations. So those are some of the nuclear-specific characteristics that we looked at for siting. Bottom line is, looking at that initial screening, we think 80% of the coal sites, operating coal sites in the United States could be suitable for a small modular reactor. We're not saying you should do that. We're saying it's possible. One of the challenges here is who moves first. Is this the community? Is it the utility? Or is it the state? Many of our coal stations are owned by utilities that don't have nuclear in their portfolio. So it's a very high hurdle to consider adding that to their portfolio in these types of decisions, which leads us to the next slide in our pilot project. We worked with the Coronado Generating Station in Northeast Arizona. It's owned by the Salt River Project. There were a few reasons why this particular site was interesting, but more than anything, the town of St. John's called us and asked us to do the study, not the utility. I actually had to approach the utility separately, but the town wanted to consider nuclear energy because they wanted the preservation of jobs. St. John's is 3,500 people in northeastern Arizona, closer to New Mexico than Phoenix. There are a number of coal units that operate in that area within commuting distance. So we also felt like what we learned at Coronado would be transportable to the other coal stations in the community. We did a more detailed siting evaluation. We helped narrow the technologies that they might want to watch in the future. And we did an economic impact assessment of transitioning to nuclear energy for the two counties, Navajo and it's gone. Give me a minute. Wow, that's a shame. Is it on, do I have a sticker on my bottle? Nope, I don't. And I want to share the economic impact assessment results with you, but from a siting perspective, we found no what we call exclusionary or avoidance factors. Exclusionary is no-go, right? Can't do it, don't consider it, you're done. Avoidance, you can spend time and money and fix it. But you need to go into it with your eyes wide open that you're going to spend time and money to fix those kinds of challenges. If we go forward 2 slides. So from an economic impact study, you can see in the chart on the bottom. So we looked at direct jobs in the plant, indirect jobs, think supply chain, and induced jobs, that's in the community for the 2 counties. And so you see the current operations, there's a labor income of, there's about 450 jobs that countywide that can be tied to the operation of the coal station. The labor income is 40 million and the economic output is 300 million, taking all of those factors into account. If you want to replace that with nuclear, you would need to at least replace half the energy, so about a 462 megawatt unit, and you end up a little bit on the plus side from an economic perspective. If you were to put in nearly 1,000 megawatts of nuclear, they would more than double the economic impact of it in those 2 counties. Apache County, thank you. I don't know why, sometimes it's after lunch, right? I did eat light too, because I didn't want that to happen, but thank you very much. If we go to the next slide. We have 2 other pilot studies that we're working on. One is in Kentucky. We're kicking off one in Montana. But if you're interested in diving deeper into this topic, at a minimum, Mr. Chairman, we could share with you what we know about the coal stations here in Kansas, if you're interested. If we could go ahead 2 more slides. Okay, we're back where we started. Every part of energy is changing. So how do you manage that? What can you do? I think one of the most important things is just understand the changes that are being considered in your state or in your region by the different sectors. This is not just about electricity. This is about delivering energy. So electricity, your industrials, your transportation, and your agriculture. There's just not a part of energy right now that's not being transformed. Start from your objectives, don't start with the technology. Every technology has its pros and cons. Start with understanding what your objectives are or what different companies in your state, what their objectives are and their needs. Understand what you have in common, understand what you might have that's cross-purpose to one another. Catalog your existing assets. One of the things we're learning about the energy transition is that our infrastructure is probably some of the most important things that we have. There's a few things that take longer to build than a nuclear power station. Transmission lines are one of those. And as you move from the East Coast to the West Coast in the United States, you have fewer nodes of transmission connection. The DOE used to call it the congestion report, right? They have a different name for it, but they talk about congestion. So as an energy professional, I think one of the most important things that we can do is repurpose the connections and the infrastructure that we have smartly. From a water perspective, here and in the West, we have to consider water scarcity. So as we're picking those technologies, making sure that we're mindful of whether they're using the same amount of water or less water. The advanced reactors are looking at air-cooled technology as well as water-cooled technology. And it doesn't have to be a once-through water-cooled technology. It can be a closed loop, which improves efficiency or efficient use of water. But again, these are all things that should interplay into the decisions we make about technology in the future. Forecasting what your new assets are going to be. Hydrogen hubs have been announced. There's 8 across the country. What is the proximity to here? Is that something that you want to participate in? Either the transportation of that hydrogen or the production. But more importantly, this is going to be an iterative process. The energy systems that we're operating today were designed and gifted to us 100 years ago, 50 years ago. That's what we're doing for the next generations. So creating the frameworks by which we can discuss this and continue to discuss this, because it's going to take decades to make an energy transition. Mr. Chair, I thank you for tolerating my challenges with my voice. But I'm open to questions, and I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I always like to hear about all this. It's very interesting. One question I have is with regard to I don't think you really dove into the cost of regulation, because to be honest, I think that seems to be the biggest hurdle in most of these states, is that, the cost of constructing the plant's one thing, but complying with all the regulations and everything else is another. How much would you say it adds to the cost of a new nuclear plant? I know Wolf Creek, we've got the capacity for more reactors, but we don't do it because the cost is enormous, and a lot of it has to do with the reaction or the regulation.
So I think, the advanced reactors offer an opportunity for there to be less regulation on the back end when we're in an operating regime. Certainly, as you go through certifying your design and getting a construction and an operating license, our current regulations were based on light water reactor technology. So you show up with a fast reactor, one of the first things you do is go, that doesn't apply, that doesn't apply, that doesn't either, right? And because we're building them smaller. So our emergency planning zones will be smaller, which will impact how many regulatory agencies you're engaging with around a nuclear power plant. I don't have a specific number.
Yeah.
I can't even hip shot that, but I believe there's opportunity for, and certainly we've learned a lot operating the light water reactor fleet for 40 years in the United States. We have the oldest operating nuclear power plants in the globe, in the world. That experience is invaluable to making sure that we don't overbake the regulation going forward.
That's a big concern. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions? I have one for you, Christina. When you look at Peely, that project 2025 looks like it's in the back of a truck trailer. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, they literally can transport these things around and use them for different reasons.
Yeah, so that's a Department of Defense project, and that's real. Okay, so it is real that the whole reactor is in the back of an 18-wheeler, and it is meant to be fueled and delivered and used for whatever time it's needed, and then delivered to the next location. So you're talking about a true mobile microreactor where it's transportable. So that challenges, that's not something we've done before. But that doesn't mean that it can't be done. The part that hasn't been done before is operating it for a partial period of time and then shipping it to somewhere else. So the Department of Defense is interested in this from, as you might imagine, a lot of our front line is powered by diesel. And so you're always having to transport in fuel for those activities on the front edges and many times in remote areas. So that's the interesting project. That is, they started with 3 specific designs, all using what's called a triso fuel. But we expect that they'll be, BWXT will be showing their first designs in 2025. Now, microreactors being deployed in remote environments but not being transportable is something that Alaska is looking at, because they have a very diverse, their community, their population is in many different smaller parts of Alaska. They don't have a lot of big metropolitan areas, and their grid actually caps out at about 500 megawatts. So for them, as they transition their energy, they also, as you might imagine, because of the weather in Alaska, they have different factors that they consider when they deploy new energy. But they've been doing a significant amount of work looking at microreactors in remote areas.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for this very interesting presentation. So when you talked about transitions, you emphasized transitions from coal. Would you have anything to say about transition from natural gas? Is that because it's a different baseload, or natural gas can go up and down more
So
easily?
the reason I'm talking about and looking at coal is because we are planning to retire about 90 gigawatts of coal in the next 10 years in the United States. That's a lot to take off of our grid. Personally, having spent some time in these rural communities, especially the mayor in St. John's, Arizona, he and I are good friends now. But, understanding the job impact associated with that. Certainly as a nuclear professional and an energy professional, I've seen the impact of the early closure of some of the nuclear stations and watched some of my colleagues struggle with the decision of moving their family. So people live in these places because that's where they want to live, and they're proud of the work that they do with energy. Natural gas produces less greenhouse gases, about 50% less than a coal station. So that's not, in terms, if you're looking at it from a decarbonization perspective, it wouldn't be your first focus if you're looking at a clean energy transition. But the reason I'm focused, there's a near-term need for our coal workers. They didn't decide to close their coal stations. They're just receiving that news. And as an energy professional, I'd like to see them have viable jobs.
I hope you're right that natural gas produces 50% less. I continue to have some concerns about methane and production, but certainly appreciate your focus on communities and workforce.
And there's not a technology that's not looking at, natural gas as well as clean coal and capture. We're all looking at how we make our technology fit into the new requirements that are being asked of us.
Any other questions? Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing you touched on was, and I knew this, but that once you use those rods, there's still about 90% of the material still available. Do the new plants, or they're talking about using a much greater portion of that before they discard that material?
Yeah, so by starting, so there's two pieces to that. By starting with a higher enrichment,
Okay.
we're going to start at the 18 to 20% range for many of these new reactors. But then also the potential of closing the fuel cycle will be able to extract more. We will always have a waste product at the end that will have fissile material associated with it, but we can make the fissile part of it less.
How much longer would it last using the higher concentration?
So if you look at a microreactor, a fast reactor design is thought you could fuel it and operate it for 20 years without refueling.
Rather than every, what, 6 or 8, something like that?
Current refueling cycles for our existing fleet are 18 months or 24 months.
Big difference.
Yeah, big
Thank you.
I've got one. Could you talk on national labs just a little bit more?
I'd love to.
Yeah, just around the country, and because I find that fascinating, so.
So it's interesting. I've been in the commercial side of the business for a long time, and the national labs was not a place that I thought I would ever work. But the national labs, so one, we have 17 in the United States, in case you didn't know that. And our national labs really do, we have some that are singularly science-focused and do fundamental science. And we have labs like Idaho National Labs, which is an applied science lab. So the intention at our laboratory is that our science is working towards commercial applications of these different technologies. So we think of ourselves more of an engineering lab. But our labs across, our nuclear-related labs across the United States range from people that are working on, big accelerator projects, which I thought I was a nerd. Okay, the accelerator guys are like the real nerds in the national lab system. But then from a nuclear reactor, nuclear energy point of view, we have Idaho National Lab funded through the Office of Nuclear Energy. And then we have a number of national labs that are funded through the Office of Science, Pacific Northwest, Argonne in Illinois, Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Los Alamos and Sandia in New Mexico. And all of us work on different aspects of not only the technology, but we also have research economists. I never thought I'd want to talk to those people either. But we have transmission experts, and we have the National Energy Technology Laboratory in West Virginia and Pennsylvania that focuses on our fossil fuel technology, and they're working on things like direct air capture and clean coal. So we really do work across the entire system, looking at the science, and we do big science at our laboratories. We do experiments that couldn't be put together by a private entity, but we can bring those private entities together to do that big science to enable some of their future work. But yeah, if you ever get the chance to tour a national lab, and there's a little nerd inside of you somewhere, I highly recommend it. If you want to come to Idaho, we'd be more than happy to have you.
Okay, is there any other questions? Okay, if not, Christina, we appreciate you coming. She come from Idaho, and she timed it just right on the weather, get to go home right. And I'd also like to say thank you, Ty. You come along too from, I don't think I introduced you earlier, Stevenson. He's a CEO from Envoy Public Labs. So thank you for coming too.
And best of luck with your new chairmanship.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, do we have any announcements anybody like to make, or I know next week, just so that you know, do some planning, that We won't meet tomorrow. We won't meet Tuesday, but we will meet Wednesday. So we'll be kind of planning Tuesday for the following week. Yes, Senator
Thank you,
Schellenberg.
Mr. I do have a question for staff.
Sure.
I served on the interim committee, and on 2 separate occasions, I asked if we could get from the Southwest Power Pool how much money they get from Kansas at all levels, from the tariffs and everything, an all-in price from, and I haven't heard anything from staff, so we may have to ask that question again. Thank you.
Work on that. Anything else? Okay, if not, meeting is adjourned.